Do you want to start again? So good afternoon, good evening. My name is Cory Labrecque. I am a professor of bioethics and theological ethics at the University of Laval in the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, where I am Vice Dean and Head of Graduate Studies in Theology. I am a McGill alum. I was trained here the entire spectrum. I did everything here at McGill. I did my bachelor's in anatomy and cell biology just up the hill at the Faculty of Medicine, and then went on to do an honors degree in religion, a master's in bioethics, and a PhD in ethics here at the university. So I'm delighted to be home in many ways. And I taught here for about 7 years and delighted in teaching at McGill. I loved my students. I taught a course called Religious Ethics in the Environment, and we had hundreds of students in the course. So it was always just a great exchange, and it's always a delight for me to be back. I am thankful to the Newman Center, to the Newman Association of Montreal, to the Newman Institute of Catholic Studies, to be able to give this lecture today, certainly bearing a very important figure's name. So without further ado, is that okay? Let's begin. It's probably not a good idea to start with something like this, right? To start off the conversation with the Black Death that decimated much of the European population. But I think this will help us give some perspective about where I'm going, right? So today, I want to talk about the ars moriendi, or the art of dying in the Christian tradition, and look at big concepts in bioethics, like vulnerability and dignity, which are at the center of Catholic discussions around bioethics. Is that okay? That's where we're headed. I hope that's okay. That's what I've found. So I hate when people say, well, no, I'm like, well, great. The Black Death. The 14th century was a disaster, if I may, of the century, right? It was apocalyptic. Probably say this about many centuries. People are saying about it just now in the shadow of the pandemic. But the 14th century, especially in Europe, started at the beginning, I think it was 1315 with the Great Famine that knocked out a giant population of Europe. What they were seeing was a change in climate, right? The temperature started to drop. There was more rain, the crops were failing, and so famine spread across the continent like fire. And not very long after, right, as they were trying to recover from the famine and the floods that accompanied the famine and so on and so forth, they were hit with the probably most excruciating plague that hit humankind on record. Right, so the Black Death, you might know about the Black Death. This was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium that was carried by fleas, right, infected fleas that would jump onto rats, infect the rats, and then the rats would follow the trade routes, right, in Asia, in Europe, and in North Africa. And so they were all over the place. And as soon as they were infecting humans, human-to-human contagion was just disastrous. And historians will say that Europe, in particular, lost 30 or maybe even up to 60% of its total population. So you can imagine kind of the impact of that, the significance of that, and what that meant for people. We know that the global pandemic, right, with COVID is going to have deep ramifications after it comes and goes. I say that with all goodness, right? We know that it's going to have a huge effect on how, or hopefully there'll be some positive effects too on society as we move through. You can imagine what the Black Death did in these parts of the world. It was called the Black Death, just in passing, because extremities, the toes, the fingers, and the nose would often turn black because of necrosis or because of the failure of the system for blood clotting. And so it was a very visible also disease. And usually you died within about a week of manifestation of symptoms. So it moved very, very quickly. I don't know if any of you have read Boccaccio's Decameron, which is a very famous piece by the Italian poet, but he survived. He was around during the Black Death and he survived it. And in his text, he talks about the fact that people were kind of moving, if they were outside, they were moving through the streets trying to avoid the corpses and the cadavers that were just spewing everywhere. Right, at some point, it was just out of control. There was obviously no system, healthcare system as we know it today. And so there was just a rampant kind of amount of death around him. And he said that it was interesting to kind of watch the reactions of people at the time. They knew that that the medical system or medicine had failed them. There was not much doctors could do. And the church was interesting, right? The relationship to the church was interesting at this time because most people resorted to prayer. And that didn't seem to be doing a great job. right? As the numbers of death kept increasing, people were wondering, it was interesting because there was not an abandonment or an apostasy, there was no abandonment of the faith, but people were assuming that their prayers were not being efficacious because there was something perhaps corrupt in the hierarchy. Isn't that interesting? So it wasn't like God is not there, it's God is there. He's not listening because there's something going wrong on high in the church. That was kind of the approach that we were seeing. There's a great book called The Lost Art of Dying that has just been published by Lydia Dugdale, who's a physician in New York. And she discovered the Christian art of dying, the Ars Moriendi, and wrote a very accessible piece on it. And she describes the Black Death as a physician, right? It's an interesting kind of approach. And she talks about how during the plague, there were three kinds of people, right? And Boccaccio describes this too. There were those who were hermetic, who were kind of like hermits, who saw the plague around them, were deeply afraid, and so they shut themselves in and kept themselves in their houses and didn't move, right? Nobody going in or out. And there were still others who saw the imminence of death around them, right? Death was everywhere, piles of bodies were everywhere, that they knew it was just a matter of time before they were next. And so they ended up becoming a little bit more hedonistic, right? Why not? Giving into pleasure and giving into all kinds of other things. A lot of them broke into the houses of the affluent, because a lot of the affluent people retreated, got out of the cities and moved to the country where they had villas, so away from the congregations, right, away where people were getting infected, and that actually saved some people. That talks to you about justice issues, but we'll leave that there. So some people would go into their houses that were left abandoned and just have parties and so on and so forth. And then there was the third route, the medial route of people who were not quite locking themselves in, but staying in for the most part, and then taking air during the evening when most people were not around. It sounds very much like, anyway, I won't make any parallels to what we're seeing today, but 500 years later, and I'm not sure how much we've learned, but let's just leave it there. What's interesting about the Black Death is that if people were not on alert in terms of their mortality, well, walking to your house with piles of cadavers all over the place probably made you a little bit more attentive, right, to the fact that we are finite. And certainly in the day, it was not an unknown thing. As you well know, children and women died in childbirth, right? This was a much more common thing than it is today. People's life expectancy was very different. And so death was not a hidden phenomenon. So that was already well known. And there was a tradition, right, that we read about from ancient Rome. You may know about this, right? From ancient Rome, it is said, at least the second or third the Christian apologetic, Tertullian talks about this in his Apologeticus. And he talks about how there was a custom or perhaps a practice in ancient Rome when a general won a war or a battle, he would be paraded through his city. And as he was paraded through his city on chariots, there would be a slave or a servant behind him, either in the chariot, but usually walking behind and never in the footsteps of, so off to the side, whispering, respice poste, right? Hominem te momento memento mori. So this language of look behind you. You are just a man and immortal at that. Remember that you will die. Enjoy the fanfare, enjoy the celebration. But if you start making yourself feel like you're more than mortal, remember that just like me, your servant, there will be justice in terms of our death. I'm not sure I want to hear that, like at graduation, when you're graduating, you're like, hooray, you're gonna die. It's not exactly the way we celebrate, but there was something very grounding. And we have something even in the church, right? You may remember that before the 1960s, when popes were named and when they were elected, they were hoisted into the papal, on the papal throne or on a chair, and they were paraded while an altar server usually, or a lower rank, if I may, a cleric, would kneel in front of the newly named pope with a burning reed, and he would say, "Sic transit gloria mundi," right? So passes the glory of the world, right? Which is a take on this. Like you're hoisted up right now, but like everyone else, right? There is justice in our mortality. So this was already well known, right? This was already well known at the time. Our finitude was already well known, but the huge concern was this. Oh, sorry, this is all this Latin that you can just use to impress your friends, was this. A sudden or an unexpected, or more particularly, an unprepared for death. It wasn't dying that was the issue. They got it, right? Finitude was for everyone. It was not being prepared for death. That was the major major concern. In the Litany of the Saints, in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian tradition, we never, forgive me, this is from my own diocese perhaps, I shouldn't be saying this, maybe in public, but we don't ever get through the entire litany, right? During the litany, during baptisms and high ranks of the church, the litany is sung, right? Certain saints, certain not all, certain saints are proclaimed and are sung, but we never really get to the very end of the litany, which is quite long. And we still have in our litany this phrase near the end of the song that says, "Subitania morte libera nos Domine," or "Save us, O Lord, from a sudden or unprepared for death." It's still in our litany today, and that was the concern, and has and continues to be a concern in modern bioethics, in fact, for the church. When the church talks about euthanasia, the church talks about medical aid in dying. We can talk about this some other time, but this whole language about taking medications to alleviate your pain, maybe at the expense of a few days of your life, not to kill you, but to manage your pain. The church often talks about, well, is it going to take consciousness away from you? Because the person needs to be able to prepare for their death. That's still today a very a major point of discussion. That's still with us. Even though you ask, I think most people, and I don't know who would do this kind of survey, but if you ask most people, how would you like to die, which is a great, great point of conversation for Thanksgiving weekend, most people will say, in my sleep. For the church, she says, oh, no, unless you are already prepared, right? Unless you're already prepared. There's this beautiful fresco in the Palazzo Vitellis in Palermo in southern Italy. I think it's beautiful. It's actually horrific now that I see it this big. It used to be hung in a hospital in Italy, and I used to, when I was a professor and head of Catholic studies and bioethics at Emory University in Atlanta, I would take my students to Italy on study abroad. So hard being a professor, I tell you. And I was teaching them bioethics, medical ethics, and there's no real better place than Italy to teach this stuff. And you can see that a lot of the art, just about 50 years or so after the Great Plague, is like this. It's called The Triumph of Death, right? That's the kind of themes, the series that we see. And it's everywhere throughout Italy, and a lot of Europe sees it too. And it's the same kind of motif that we see throughout, where death has I don't know how much you can see from where you are, but death has a prominent place in the center. Do you see that on the horse? An emaciated horse. Death is presented as a skeleton with a scythe at his side or her side, and has a bow at the ready and is striking people. And this used to hang in a hospital, and I'm not sure how many patients want this in their room, but there was a certain memento mori about it, right? That everyone who comes through these walls, doctors or patients, will come to their end in time. What's interesting here is that underneath you can see this pile of cadavers. And why it's interesting is that this was, again, one of the deep concerns of the people now almost a century after the Great Plague still, right? It was still haunting them. The fact that the plague was non-discriminate or was indiscriminate. Everyone was dying. It didn't matter how close they thought you were to God, everyone was dying. And so if you look very carefully at this pile, there is an emperor in there. There are bishops, cardinals, there are popes in there as well. There are different ranks of the clergy, there are maidens and laypersons, they're all lumped together in one pile, right? Again, this idea of the justice of mortality. The arrow finds everyone. Now, what's interesting, I keep saying it's interesting, which is fascinating, let me change the word here, is that you'll see that death is on his or her way toward this group of affluent, well-dressed people who are having a great time. Well, for the 15th century, that's a great time. That's a party era. You might not recognize that. But they're not paying attention to death. I don't know if you can see that. They're paying attention to their own worldly affairs, and death is coming for them. So they don't know what's coming. This is the suddenness of death. At the other side of the horse are a group of poor and sick people. Most of them are sick. You'll see images of leprosy. I don't know if you see this, the binding of the arms because the hands are missing. There's somebody who was mysteriously looking at us in the distance there. That could be the author. The author of this piece is unknown. It was common, right, to paint yourself into a picture, kind of into the background. But they are reaching out for death, asking for death, and death pays no attention to them, right, which is interesting. That he ignores the ones who are on the cusp, but he is headed towards the one who have forgotten, right, about the mortality. After the Great Plague had hit, A few years later, a few decades later, the church convened the Council of Constance. And this was because right after the Great Plague, so remember I told you at the beginning of that century, there was a great famine, and then there was a great plague that knocked out a giant amount of the population. And not many years after was the Western Schism in the church, where there were 3 claims to the papal throne, right? From Avignon, from Rome, and Pisa. The church was not having a good time, right? Post-plague. And it was a very divisive time for the church. And so the church convenes in 1414, the Council of Constance, to talk about the schism and all kinds of other things that were happening right in the church at the time. And so what ends up happening here is a theologian, as you well know, during these councils, the church often calls experts from the world to convene, to come into the councils to help counsel the church on matters that are important to the council. And one of the people that was invited was a French scholar named Jean Dred Scott, who was well known. As an aside, I read some time ago that at 32, he was named Chancellor of the University of Paris. I mean, 32, I was still using Velcro to tie my shoe. So a guy of well-known, a guy of reputation, and he came in to counsel on a variety of themes, but they ended up asking him to write a short treatise on the science and art of dying. And that ended up getting a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of press just yet, right? But a lot of attention, and it would end up spurring this tradition, or rather the textual tradition called the Ars Moriendi. Are you all with me? Mm-hmm. So about 1415 to about 1450, there were 2 types of texts that were released based on Gaston's first little treatise on dying. And it was called The Art of Dying. There was a long text that was produced right after this council and kind of inspired by this council. And in the long text, there were a number of chapters. This is a text, right? I'm talking about the 15th century, right now, 500-600 years ago. And in the Ars Moriendi, in this long text that was produced right after the council, there was a first chapter, and it was written towards a lay public. It was not written for the clergy. It was a text that was written for people. Why? Because people were freaking out about dying. That's not very professional. People were really concerned about dying without clerics at their side. Right? That's what they had seen. That's what they had experienced in the famine. That's what they were experiencing during the plague. The priests were going, the deacons were going, and some people were abandoning the village. Others were staying put in order to serve and to tend, and they were dying because of it, right? And so people were realizing that there was another deep fear. It was not just an unprepared for death, but an unaccompanied death. No priest, no deacon, no religious at my side to guide me, right, as I transition from one life to the next. And so from the Council of Constance, there was this text that was produced for everybody. It was first produced in Latin, and then it was translated into every language under the sun. And it moved very quickly through Europe, and then everywhere else for that matter, it actually made its way centuries later into the United States, into North America, and so on and so forth. In the text, at least in the old, and I'm talking about 600 years ago, the first chapter talks about how you shouldn't be afraid of death. And that in fact, the fact that we are all mortal, there's a certain solidarity in that. Right? And the church talks about this in the first chapter there. And then it talks about how to prepare for a good death. And the second chapter of the text is really where there's a lot of attention. It talks about all the temptations you see as you are dying. What are the temptations? Well, as I am dying and suffering, my first temptation is to give up on my faith, because it seems like God is no longer perhaps present. We know this eternal prayer. Why have you abandoned me? The words of Christ himself on the cross from the book of Psalms. Right? Where are you? Where are you? This language that is still said and uttered by believers, and I would say even non-believers too, sometimes, right? When you start asking these deep questions of existence. And so that second chapter is all about these things that happen as you are dying, these temptations to give up your faith, your temptation to despair, temptations for impatience, right? This temptation around being very impatient as you are drawn out in your suffering, for instance. Complacency, attachment to the world, not wanting to leave, all of these temptations. And when this text was written, the understanding was that the deathbed was kind of like the scene of a deep drama between the devil, who was tempting you because you were in a weakened state, And as your faith was kind of being perhaps wrested from you because of the experience, the devil was about to take your soul, that language, right, of the preservation of the soul. At the other end of the bed is an angel. So while the devil is saying, lose faith, lose your faith, there's no God here, the angel is on the other side of the bed saying, no, there's no need. God is with you, so on and so forth. And so there's this wrestling over the soul of the dying, right, by the angels and by the devil. And it's almost as if the dying person is just like a spectator watching the whole thing, right? It's kind of an interesting thing. So there's this whole language about temptations. There's another chapter about questions that you should be asking the dying, which seems kind of a lot to me. Excuse me, if you don't mind. And then these questions are about self-examination. It's almost like an examination of conscience, right? To be in a particular state as we prepare for a transition. Then there's a chapter on the Imitatio Christi, right? And it's actually beautiful, this one. They're all very interesting. But the Imitatio Christi is on the Passion of Christ. And it's this language of the 5 great activities of Christ in his own passion and his own dying. So this idea that Jesus cries, the idea that Jesus weeps, cries out, weeps, prays, commends his soul to God, and so on and so forth. And it stops with all of those things so that the dying can reflect on his experience and Christ's experience. And my favorite, if I may, is this 5th chapter, which is an instruction for those at the deathbed. This is made for people to accompany the dying when there are no priests around, or if there are priests around. But if there's no one around, your mom, your dad, your husband, whoever it is that's there, the understanding is that here is some instruction for you as you are dying. You will be accompanied. And the understanding is this deep wisdom that it's really hard to talk about a good death if the death is experienced in isolation. And I still think there's a lot to say about that. Just in passing, if I may, just in passing, because we don't have time for it. The number of unclaimed bodies in hospitals in Quebec and Ontario are exorbitant. Do you know that? The number of bodies that are still in hospitals after people die and are just left there because nobody comes to claim them or to be with them as they're dying or so on and so forth, seems to suggest that there's something, I think, scandalous, right, about this idea of isolation and dying alone, right, which is something that the church binds itself to. And finally, this chapter on commendations to be said over the dying as they are dying. This is just, so there was that long version, remember I said there was this long version that was produced? A few decades later, after it was circulated everywhere and everyone was reading this text and understanding it and practicing it, they said it needs to be even more accessible. And so the only people that are using it are the literate. And so they created a shorter version, a synopsis, a Cole's note. Is Cole's note still a thing? I don't know. A synopsis, a summary of the long version that had more illustrations and pictures in it so people could learn it that way. Like the stained glass of the church, right? The way that she teaches about deep and abiding themes. And so in the shorter version, we have these kinds of woodcuts. Many of them were like woodcuts. And a lot of them are, here's the creepy, whatever this is, some devil monster. And you can see that the death area or the evil area and the angel who's doing well over here, they're fighting, right? For this is the soul, the representation of the soul is here. They're fighting for the soul of the Morians, the dying. And that's what it is at the end. That's why you need to be so well prepared. Because as you drift off, there is now a battle for the soul. That was the understanding. Are we good? The art of dying is so relevant 600 years later. No? So relevant 600 years later. There's this lovely passage from the still, I guess, Joseph Ratzinger, right? Pope Benedict, who as a cardinal wrote a great text called Eschatology. And in the text, he talks or laments the fact that sickness and death are really technical problems, technically handled by technical people. And so he talks about the technologization of death, and because of that, the dehumanization, right? We talk about this all the time. There's another really long series of texts on death by Philippe Barriez, who wrote this, a tome, like, it's not overnight reading, a gigantic text on how the Western world has seen death over the ages. And he talks about the universality of death. At the beginning, everyone got the fact that we're all finite, and then it became the denial of death, and then it became the fear of death, and then it becomes now the control of death. or the medicalization of death, right? Which is hidden and cast away, often in hospitals and so on and so forth. And because we don't have that exposure anymore to death, it's tricky for us to accompany the death. Yeah? So the art of dying, I think, is very rich because it's all about, I think, this. I think this is what it understands, vulnerability, right? It understands that at the heart of it all is the fact that every human being is vulnerable. And it doesn't matter if you're the cardinal or the pauper or whoever you are, man, woman, child, doesn't matter how much money. At the end of the day, all humans are sealed with vulnerability. In my field, in bioethics, vulnerability is sometimes used to describe the other. I don't know about how you use vulnerability, but often in literature, we talk about the vulnerable, them, the others, people with disabilities, people who are, I don't know, children, et cetera, right? The others, the vulnerable. The word is so rich, right? It comes from the Latin. I think this is the last time we do the Latin thing. Vulnerare, it means wound. So to be vulnerable means to be woundable. And if you think of vulnerability like that, it changes everything. And I prefer to use woundability than vulnerability, right? Because suddenly it's not the vulnerable other, it's the woundable you and I, right? And I think that changes the way we accompany the dying, right? Because the whole ars moriendi was based also on something called the ars vivendi, that you can't speak about the art of dying if you haven't spoken about how to live well either. And what they say, at the beginning of the chapters of the ars moriendi, is that those of you who go on to accompany the dying, the first thing that you need to do is come to some kind of accounting of your own mortality. Because if you don't come to that, to your own vulnerability, you're in no way poised to accompany those who are dying. Because you'll always think of them as the other. I'm nowhere near you. I'm not nowhere near that. I don't have to know this just now. And that keeps a certain distance from us and the ones we serve. Isn't that interesting? So I think that language of woundability is important, certainly in the church. And also this stuff, right? The word dignity is thrown around everywhere. And the first thing that you need to do when it comes to dignity is to ask the person what they mean by it. That's what I think. Just as an aside, I remember when I was at Emory, I was interviewed by a prominent news feed after the death of Brittany Maynard. I don't know if you know about Brittany Maynard. This is 6 years ago, 8 years ago. Brittany Maynard, very, very quickly, a woman in her 20s, had just gotten married. I think she just got her master's degree too. Her life, the world at her feet, everything is wonderful. Long story short, headaches, went to her doctor, third stage cranial cerebral cancer. Just like that. Asked questions, treatment. We do a lot of stuff, right? When you're in your 20s. Goes back to her doctor sometimes later, and now she's fourth stage and has a prognosis of 6 months. And she asks her physician, so what is the next 6 months going to look like? And he starts to describe the condition. You'll lose your ability to talk. You'll gain a lot of weight because of the medication. Their pain will try to manage, but it can't be managed perfectly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, you know what? No thanks. She went to Oregon and became, and signed up with Dying with Dignity, right? The movement Dying with Dignity, a pro-euthanasia movement, and died with that movement. I was interviewed the day after she passed away. And the question by this very prominent news source was, is this Cory, I think it was the barbecue, because they can't pronounce my last name, it's French. And I said, this is me, the barbecue, yes. And they said, are you the Catholic? I remember this very clearly. And I'm like, who is this? I'm like, yes, it's me, the Catholic Church. How can I be of service? And they said, you're the Catholic bioethicist? I said, yes. And they said, do you know the story of Brittany Maynard? And then I stopped and I'm like, oh, I see what's happening here. And I'm like, yes. And they said, just one question for this journal, this magazine. Can you just tell us why the church is so against dying with dignity? And I said, oh, no, you're mistaken. I think we invented the concept. And then there was a long pause, right? Because it's like, but I thought the church was not a fan of euthanasia. I said, oh, no, we're not. And there was a long pause, right? And it's because of this understanding of what you think dignity is. And I think it's so important that we seal that here. So let me just take some time with that. Is that okay? Let me take a few more minutes with dignity and link it to the way we understand people and persons. Okay? Dignity and personhood come hand in hand. And here's another word that's often thrown around all the time: persons. And some of us use them synonymously, you know, persons and people and human beings and so on and so forth. But a lot of people will ask this question: is there a moral difference between human being and human person, or are they the same thing? For the church, they are the same, one and the same. But I think in the Western world, there's a large kind of trend to separate the two in some way. And then the more important question becomes, well, if you have an understanding of human person, and not all human beings are persons, because there's a certain understanding about that not all human beings count as persons, which is a category of protection, right? Then the question becomes who counts and who decides who counts, right? Which human beings count, and who are the people that are deciding which human beings count as persons who deserve to be protected and have rights and privileges and so on and so forth. Are you with me? Just let me give you an example. And I'm using American examples because I was there for a while, right? So some cases. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. This was a case, Supreme Court, that ruled that whether you were free or slave, any human being in the US that had African descent or that were of African descent were not persons under the Constitution. When we talk about persons in the Constitution, we're not talking about you. In 1886, so not that very far, so this is before the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Not long after, there was another court case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company in 1886, that said a collection of property can be afforded constitutional protections that we usually afford human persons. Do you follow this? Black people do not count as persons. Property can be considered persons. Do you see something selective here? Are you with me? Do you see this? Roe versus Wade in 1973, even though this was about the constitutionality or this idea of privacy and the right to abortion and so on and so forth, which was a very important case, also was a case of a personhood, fetal personhood, right? Deciding who counts in the category. So we've been very selective, and I can imagine who's doing the ruling. I'd imagine there are some white men here involved in the ruling here. So this selective bestowal of personhood on some human beings. Just to give you another sense, here in Canada, women were legally declared persons in 1929. For those of us who are theologians, that's yesterday. That's yesterday. My grandmothers were both born non-persons. Beforehand, though, British common law in the land claimed that women, forgive me, were persons in the matter of pains and penalties, but not in the matter of rights and privileges. So if a woman did something wrong, she was tried as a person, but she didn't have the rights and privileges of a person. Selective, no? Selective. So there are two ways of thinking about persons. There's the physicalist approach, right? Have you ever heard of this stuff before? So physicalism says that if you're a human being, you're a human person. Period. Ipso facto, right? It doesn't matter if you have, it doesn't matter race, gender, none of that stuff matters. Nothing matters. If you're a human being, you're a human person. You count as a person, which is that category of protection with rights and so on and so forth. You count. That's the church, the Catholic Church's sense, right? It is physicalist. The flip side of that is another approach that I think is actually more common in the world in which we live, which is personalism. Be careful, because this word is used differently in different places, and even John Paul II uses it in a very different way. So just be careful here. Personalism says that you count as a person only if you can perform certain capacities and functions. Do you follow me? What those are up for grabs. Usually it's self-consciousness and rationality and so on and so forth. But if you perform those things, then you count as a person. If you don't, you're out. And so personalists will say that certain human beings do not count because they've lost that capacity or they've never had those capacities. But they might say that certain animals count though, right? So animal ethics often is axed towards, it's kind of focused on this personalist approach. So physicalism says human being equals person. Personalism says it doesn't matter what being you are, as long as you have these functions intact, you count as a person. Okay, do you see that? The two approaches. Let me give you an example, right, of that, of personalism. One of the great pioneers of bioethics was formerly an Episcopalian priest who became an atheist in his bioethical training. That doesn't happen to all of us, in case you're wondering. Joseph Fletcher, right, the American, he wrote a book called Humanhood. And in it, he says, look, I get that it's hard to define personhood. And I know that's at the center of all of our discussions about abortion, about euthanasia, about whatever, right? Personhood is right front and center, right? The who counts kind of question, which seems absurd. He says, I know there's a lot of debate. I'm going to take a crack at it, but look at the language that he uses here. Very confident. He says, humans without some minimum of intelligence or mental capacity are not persons, no matter how many of their organs are active, no matter how spontaneous their living processes are. If the cerebrum is gone due to disease or accident and only the midbrain or brainstem is keeping autonomic functions going, they are only objects, not subjects. They are its, not thous. Just because heart, lungs, and the neurological and vascular systems persist, we cannot say a person exists. Non-cerebral organisms are not persons. He goes on to make a list of the criteria you need to have in order to count as a person. Now, I don't want you to make a list and count, check off the ones that you have, right? It's maybe not a good idea. But he talks about, first of all, minimal intelligence. And he said, any human whose IQ score is less than 40 on a standard Sanford Binet test is questionably a person. An IQ less than 20 is certainly not. Why 40 and not 38 or 47? I have no idea. And let's not even talk about the controversy of these kinds of intelligence tests. I've done a lot of them online. I was one of those students at McGill, right, who would be writing a paper that was, should I say this out loud? That was writing a paper that was due not long after I was writing the paper. And would see a pop-up. In my day, that was a very common thing. A pop-up with Einstein that said, are you smarter than me? Click here. And I'm like, yes, click. And then I would spend 3 hours where I should have been writing paper. But these IQ tests, right, these intelligence tests are always very wary. But he said minimal intelligence was one of the criteria, was one among the criteria. You need to be self-aware, you needed to be in control of yourself, you need to have a certain sense of time, including a sense of futurity and of the past. So people with dementia and other memory issues are off this list. A sense of futurity, I don't know, what about little children, at what age do children bind up with these particular criteria? He kept going. You need to have concern for others. This is the criterion for personhood. The capacity to relate to others. So if you're somebody who prefers to be under the table at parties because you're a socially you don't like to be with other people, that was totally, you're out. Communication, he says isolated individuals don't count as persons. And he talks about, again, control of existence. He says those who are ignorant and helpless. That's the antithesis of what it means to be a person. You have to be open to curiosity. You have to be with affect. To be indifferent is to be inhuman. He talks about openness to change and changeability. He talks about the need to have a balance of rationality and feeling, and you have to be unique. And finally, he ties it all back down to new cortical function. He says, if you have these criteria, you count as a person, otherwise, not great for you. Now, it's never clear if I have 9 out of 15, like, is that okay? And what happens when I fall asleep and all of these criteria go right out the window? Like, how does that work? Right, none of this is ever addressed, but this is a very functionalist approach. And it's the one in which I think we live, in fact. He went on to say very famously or infamously that, as an example, this is the example of Down syndrome. This is in 1968, if I remember, some time ago. People have no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome baby away, whether it's put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, he says, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a downs, he calls the individual, is not a person. That's functionalism, this kind of functionalism in personhood. Do you see that? So this kind of thinking says that at the end of the day, if your functions are intact, you're a person, and you're a person clothed with dignity, right? That whole language about dying with dignity, and I don't want to get into the intricacies of this. This is not the point here, right? I'm debating about dying with dignity. But just the expression, dying with dignity, suggests, right, that you want to die before your dignity is gone. right? The language that puts dignity in line with function, right? When you lose your functions, now you're wearing certain kinds of continence pads, for instance, because you're no longer continent, right? Like a diaper, for instance. Or if you can't take care of yourself, or you can't make autonomous decisions, you can't speak anymore, whatever these functions might be that you might lose with disease, with age, with time, you are also not just losing that, you're also losing dignity, right? And that's what we see, I think, in the world around us, right? This almost like a curve, right? You're born with, I don't know what kind of dignity. You gain your functions, you're doing really well, you're at the height of your function, and you've got all your dignity, and then, oops, it's all gone. That language doesn't work well in the Christian tradition, as you can imagine. And this whole language of vulnerability, and this is what I want to end with, right? This language of vulnerability, again, is not supposed to lead you to this notion that there is no dignity for those who have no function, those who are exceedingly woundable and exceedingly wounded. It's supposed to lead us in a very different direction, right? Which is that whole language of compassion. This is from Henry Nouwen. When Jesus saw the crowd harassed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd, he felt with them in the center of his being. When Jesus saw the blind, the paralyzed, and the deaf being brought to him from all directions, he trembled from within and experienced their pains in his own heart. When he noticed that the thousands who had followed him for days were tired and hungry, he said, I am moved with compassion. And so it was with the two blind men who called after him, the leper who fell to his knees in front of him, and the widow of Nain who was bearing her only son. They moved him. They made him feel with all his intimate sensibilities the depth of their sorrow. He became lost with the lost, hungry with the hungry, and sick with the sick. And this compassion that the church talks about is supposed to ultimately lead us to something called the ministry of presence. Our Anglican brethren speak about this, the covenant of presence, of being present. Too many of us, I think, at the deathbed don't know what we're supposed to say, don't know what we're supposed to do, don't know how we're supposed to behave, which is all that the Ars Moriendi is about, right? How to maintain yourself. But the primary of the Ars Moriendi is to just be at the bedside, period. And that is called a ministry. In fact, in the church, it is a sacred ministry, to just be at the bedside. You already see this language with Christ in Gethsemane. Do you know this, right? When Jesus is in Gethsemane, what does he say to his friends when he brings them to the garden just as he's about to be arrested? Stay here, just stay here. And he goes and prays. If you read those prayers, they're very beautiful and hard to read, right? Let this pass for me, he says. Let this pass for me, right? He says about his suffering, however, if you will, right? Depending on your will. And you see this language. There's this beautiful piece from William Blake called The Agony of the Garden, where Jesus is being propped up by the angel. He's not being taken away. He's not being flown away by the angel, but the angel is propping him up. This language of presence, right? This language of presence that we see in the great texts. Now and again. When we honestly ask ourselves which persons in our lives mean the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions or cures even, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The one who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, that's very important, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness, our woundability. That is a person who cares. That's the church's definition of caring, by the way, right? The Christian motto in healthcare has always been to cure when possible, to care always. For centuries, that's been our devise, our motto. So what does this all look like, right? The Ars Moriendi has just, inspired all of this stuff. And so what does it look like on the ground? And I think it starts with kind of a certain bedside manner that recognizes our co-woundability, right? That's what I think the Ars Moriendi is doing. Recognize that the one who is dying is wounded, and you are wounded too, and you are woundable too, and you are mortal too, because you will be in that bed, and hopefully there'll be somebody at your side when it's happening too. Right, that language of mortality and finitude that we try, certainly in our youth, to keep at bay. And one of the things that's beautiful about, I think, the Ars Moriendi is that the text was written for everybody. And since it was not accessible to the literate, they made pictures of it so that everybody could get it. And it didn't matter if you were a sinner or a saint, it was for everybody. In fact, for centuries, the church already knew that if you were dying, then they should do whatever it should do whatever it could to administer the sacraments at the end of your time, whether you were a sinner or not, right? The whole idea is that the deathbed conversion, right, this language of repentance and confession at the end actually held meaning. And priests were asked to be at your side no matter what. And so this whole idea of, well, what if the person, it doesn't matter. There's this accompaniment. God will take care of what happens next. Your job, our mandate, is to accompany and to be present to. And so I think the first thing is to avoid these assumptions. Sinner, saint, what's happening here? Doesn't matter. Accompany. Sit at the bedside. I have a lot of stories about assumptions that I could share with you, but time's running. Genuine and active or mutual listening, right, with the one in the beds who is at the bedside. Very often we include stories, right, and so on and so forth. But there's this language of active listening, even in the silence, that needs to be bound there. And finally, this covenant of presence. And I'll end with this story. My mom passed away in 2018, not very long ago. And it was the worst, the hardest, you can imagine, the hardest experience of my life. I'm trained in this material. This is my thing, if I may. I'm an end-of-life bioethicist who has been working on these issues my entire life, really my entire life. My dad died when I was 1, so I was kind of shadowed, right, in death since young. I was always under the shadow of the little one that was dead, right? That was always under that shadow. So I knew it very, very well. And then when my mom was dying, I remember this beautiful experience, which was everything about this covenant of presence. My mother died at home, in bed at home. We decided to stay home with palliative care. Quebec has the luxury, I think, and the great freedom and the great beauty of being able to have people to come to our homes when we're dying. That's a thing that happens here. And as my mom was dying, we'd have an agent, we'd have a proposé, we would have doctors, we'd have nurses that would come to the house and would do what they need to do, and they'd show us how to administer pain medication and so on and so forth. Everything was fine and well. And when my mom was, when the light was flickering and the candle was almost out, there was a knock at the door. It was a woman. She said, "Hi, is this the house of Mrs. Labrecque?" And I said, "This is." And she said, "I'm a proposé from the CLSC, and I've come to wash your mom." And I said, "I'm so sorry to tell you this, but I don't think she's going to make the day. I'm sorry that this was a waste of your time for you to come all the way here, but there's no need." And she said, "Oh, on the contrary." She goes, and this I remember very clearly. She said, "I never graduated high school." She said, I just graduated high school. I didn't go any further. I'm not rocket science, I'm not a rocket scientist. There are a lot of things that I don't know, but what I do know is that there's a certain art to the respect of dignity for people who seem like they have none left. And so washing is what I do. And she came in and she washed my dying mother and she left. It was just one act, a very simple, and I'm not sure it did anything, right? It's not like my mother was dirty, like you wash because you have to get clean or whatever it is. Was there a need for that, a physical need? Absolutely not. There was something else there. There was something else very important there that I, with a PhD from one of the best universities in the world, Warwick University, did not acknowledge. That language of the ministry and sacred. No priest, no religious, simple, come on in, washed with a cloth, turned, blanketed, and left. It took maybe 10 minutes for a deep sacrality. And that, I think, is the ars moriendi. It doesn't matter. None of it matters, except the presence, right? This deep presence. And that was the call of Christ himself, right at the end of his time. Just stay awake with me. He doesn't say, "Please get me this, please do this." Stay awake. Right, that language of stay awake. And I think that's what the ars moriendi is all about. Okay? The end. There you are. That's all right.